Yes? All right. Welcome to the Duane Morris COVID-19 Navigating Forward webinar series. I'm Sheila Wiggins, a litigation partner in our New Jersey office. Today's webinar focuses on the Biden administration impact on COVID-19 legal concerns. The administration has been moving very fast, so this webinar is current as of January 27. Regarding the format of the webinar, first, Alan Kessler will set the stage by discussing the federal landscape, including legal and regulatory issues and key players. Second, Paul Josephson will discuss state-level implications and opportunities. Third, we'll take a deeper dive analyzing the impact of COVID-19 on education law with Lisa Scruggs and international contracts and trade with Rosa Ertz by analyzing, first, the impact of COVID to date, second, what's new under the Biden administration, and third, recommendations and best practices. We'll answer questions at the end. Let me introduce our presenters. Rosa Ertz is a partner in our New York office focusing on corporate law, finance, international trade for domestic, multinational, and foreign companies. She works extensively with domestic and Latin American companies, doing inbound and outbound investments and business in Mexico and other Latin American countries. She currently serves as the president of the Northeast chapter of the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce. She's also a member of the firm's Cuba business practice and the Mexican and Latin American desks. Paul Josephson is a partner in our New Jersey offices, focusing on government contracting and regulatory litigation, economic incentives, and infrastructure development. He has represented or advised 3 presidents, 6 New Jersey governors, including the current Governor Murphy, 2 state senators, and other public officials on matters of law and policy. He is policy counsel for the New Jersey Cannabis Industry Association, the New Jersey co-chair of the Regional Plan Association for New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and a trustee of the New Jersey Charter School Association. Alan Kessler. He is a partner in our Philadelphia office, practicing in the area of commercial litigation, with a focus on class actions and other complex litigation, government relations, and general counseling. He has been a member of the U.S. presidential transition teams and has worked with the Biden transition over the last few months. He has been a presidential appointee as the vice chair of the Presidential Congressional Commission on Risk Assessment and Risk Management, and was a presidential appointee, who was then confirmed by the U.S. Senate, to the Board of Governors of the United States Postal Office, for which he was the vice chair in 2005, the chair in 2008, and then reappointed for a second term by President Obama in 2009. He has also advised governors in Pennsylvania and mayors as part of their transition teams. Lisa Scruggs is a partner in our Chicago office, focusing on litigation and counseling services for education and school reform organizations, including charter and private schools. She also works with education management organizations, and she is nationally recognized as an expert in school reform. She has worked with the Chicago Public Schools, the 3rd largest school district in the U.S., in a number of different capabilities. She has also served as an expert review panelist for grant competitions sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Innovation and Improvement. She has also been selected as a PAHARA Aspen Education Fellow, joining a cohort of leaders who are reimagining America's public school. So first, we'll turn over the presentation to Alan Kessler. Excuse me, Alan,
Yes.
Just unmute.
I am unmuted.
Oh, we hear you now.
Okay. Well, it's a great start. Thanks, Sheila. As I sit here, folks, with my iPhone on top of my laptop, because for some reason we couldn't access it through my laptop. So I hope everybody hears me and can see me. And with that, let me get started. In 1992, the Clinton campaign strategist, James Carville, famously coined the campaign's theme as "It's the economy, stupid." President Biden could certainly have coined his aggressive response to COVID as it's the science stupid. What I'd like to do in going through an awful lot that's happened over the last month, unfortunately, a lot that didn't happen over the last year, is the Biden team approach to COVID-19, focusing first on the WHO, the senior team members, and then the what. The WHO's led by the Biden Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. Ron previously served as general counsel to the Gore Recount Committee in 2000. I actually worked with him on that. As chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee when Joe Biden was committee chairman. Also served as chief of staff for Vice President Al Gore, U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, and then Vice President Joe Biden. And Ron was also the White House Ebola response coordinator in 2014. Deputy Chief of Staff in this area, Steve Ricchetti. Steve was just chairman of the Biden presidential campaign, and previously during the Obama administration was an assistant to the president and chief of staff to Biden. With respect to COVID specifically, the chairs of the COVID-19 advisory team include Dr. David Kessler, who served as FDA commissioner from 1990 to 1997, appointed by President George H.W. Bush and then by President Bill Clinton. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who in addition to serving on the advisory team, it will be the incoming Surgeon General, a doctor of internal medicine who also served as Surgeon General under President Obama. He actually resigned in April 2017 at the request of the Trump administration. Dr. Marcella Muniz-Smith. Dr. Smith's a professor of epidemiology and assistant dean for health equity research at Yale. The advisory committee includes 6 board members. This is on slide 3. I'm not going to get into each of the board members, but I will just mention in passing 3 of them. Dr. Luciana Borio, who worked for the FDA and helped develop and execute the U.S. response to H1N1 and Ebola. Dr. Rick Bright, who oversaw the government's production and purchase of vaccine before his dismissal last April. Dr. Bright filed a whistleblower complaint alleging that his early warnings about the coronavirus were ignored. And Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, who's an oncologist and was a health advisor for Obama from 2009 to 2011 when he helped craft the Affordable Care Act. Dr. Emanuel, by the way, is local, happens to be a vice provost and professor at the U of P. In terms of the senior advisors on COVID, the first you may have heard of, maybe some on this call have heard of, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Actually, Dr. Fauci has become a household name, was appointed director of NIAID in 1984, has a portfolio of applied research to prevent, diagnose, and treat established infectious diseases. Dr. Fauci's advised 7 presidents on HIV, AIDS, and many other domestic and global health issues, and was one of the principal architects of the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who is a professor of medicine at Harvard. Dr. Walensky has been influential in advancing international health policy towards the promotion of HIV treatment. Xavier Becerra, who will be the incoming secretary of HHS, currently the Attorney General of California, who previously served 13 terms in the U.S. Congress. And to round out this group, Jeff Zients. Jeff is the White House COVID-19 coordinator. He is a true Biden insider who was director of the National Economic Council under President Obama, served twice as the acting director of OMB, and was appointed by President Obama to a then newly created position of the United States Chief Performance Officer. So it is, I think from the credentials and their experience, you can see that this is a group that, for the most part, is heavy into science, and has been, a number of whom have been at work now for months, even before President Biden won in November. Turning to the what, and I'm going to do this by taking you through various Biden pronouncements. As Sheila mentioned, a lot has happened in a very short period of time and continues to happen. But this whole area or subject and work actually began in April 2020, before Biden even formally clinched the nomination, under the transition leadership of, at that time, of former Senator Ted Kaufman. Ted took the Biden Senate seat when Joe Biden became vice president. So on December 29th, during one of his first speeches squarely addressing the pandemic, President-elect Biden highlighted 5 points concerning the federal government initiatives under his administration. And a number of you probably remember this. The first was things were going to get better before they get worse. Get worse before they get better. That people who are infected today don't show up in the case counts for weeks. And those who die from the disease often die weeks after exposure. Second, that the Trump administration's plan to distribute vaccines fell far behind. In November, the Trump administration announced that 20 million Americans would be vaccinated by the end of December. Right. Instead, only 3 million were vaccinated by the end of 2020. Third, that the Biden administration plans were to have 100 million vaccines administered by the end of the first 100 days. And on that, a number of you have probably read where Biden is now projecting 1.5 million vaccinations a day, which obviously would take us beyond the 100 million. Fourth, that President-elect Biden vowed to use the Defense Production Act to order private industry to accelerate materials needed for the vaccine, and would also launch a massive public education campaign to increase vaccine acceptance. Fifthly, the administration would require masks for federal workers in federal facilities and on interstate travel. On that same day, December 29th, President-elect Biden also announced the coordinators for the 3 crucial aspects of the COVID-19 response: supply chain management, vaccinations, and testing. This is slide 7, 8, and 9. The supply chain management coordinator, Tim Manning, will oversee the federal effort focusing on securing and ensuring a sustainable pandemic supply chain with sufficient PPE, tests, vaccines, and related supplies and equipment. The vaccinations coordinator, Dr. Bashara Shohair, will focus on making sure vaccines turn into vaccinations by coordinating the timely, safe, and equitable delivery of COVID-19 vaccinations. And finally, the testing coordinator, Carol Johnson, will oversee the federal effort to expand COVID-19 testing, with an emphasis on expanding and targeting testing for schools, nursing homes, and other at-risk populations. The coordinator will chair the National Pandemic Testing Board, which will work to ensure equitable test allocations. Moving ahead, on January 14th, 2021, just a week before he was sworn in, President-elect Biden's proposed a two-step plan of rescue and recovery. The first step is known as the American Rescue Plan, and the second step as Build Back Better Recovery Plan. By the way, Moody's said this approach will create more than 18 million jobs. So the American Rescue Plan, which is set forth or referred to on slide 11, will require $400 billion in funding from Congress. It includes immediate relief, additional stimulus checks totaling $2,000. It extends unemployment insurance for millions of workers, 11 additional weeks, with a $400 supplement rather than the $300 provided in the last stimulus legislation. It will also tackle hunger crisis. It will extend emergency nutrition assistance for 43 million children and families. It will extend nationwide restrictions on evictions and foreclosures, requiring that Congress fund rental assistance for 14 million families. State and local governments will receive resources to facilitate more testing, protective equipment, and ventilation systems in schools. The rescue plan finally will provide flexible grants to help small businesses, as well as low-cost capital to help entrepreneurs create and maintain jobs, focusing on minority-owned small businesses and women-owned small businesses. Turning to the Build Back Better Recovery Plan on slide 12, it will feature investments in infrastructure, manufacturing, innovation, research, development, and clean energy. Now, President Biden has yet to fully outline the Build Back Better Recovery Plan, but will do so in his first address to the joint session of Congress in February. On January 15th, President-elect Biden announced various specific initiatives of the federal government to combat COVID-19, working with state governments to define priority groups. So the process of establishing priority groups is driven by science, but the problem has been in the implementation, which has been too rigid and confusing. Second, establishing more vaccination sites, establishing thousands of community vaccination sites or centers, and Biden instructed FEMA to begin setting up these centers. By the end of January, the plan is to have 100 federally supported centers across the nation that will ultimately vaccinate millions of people, and that has started. Such sites include school gyms, sports stadiums, and community centers. Next, activating pharmacies nationwide to distribute the vaccine. The Biden administration has begun a major effort already in place in a number of cities, working directly with both independent and chain pharmacies to get America vaccinated. Next, ramping up the supply of the vaccine. The Trump policy held back close to half of the supply. The Biden administration will release the vast majority of the vaccines when they are available. So more people can get vaccinated quickly while still maintaining a reserve for any unforeseen purchases or delays. And many of you have seen or read that Biden's administration will purchase another $200 million more dollars of vaccine. The administration will also make sure that state and local government officials know how much supply they're getting and when to expect it so that they can plan. Now, many local governments can't plan because they don't know how much supply they will be receiving and what the time frame will be. Finally, the administration also promises to provide regular updates. And by the way, in that respect, is currently and intends to hold to 3 news conferences, at least 3 news conferences a week. Moving to January 21st. So the president gets sworn in on January 20th. The very next day, he issues 10 executive orders. This is slide 15, and other directives. These orders provided for an increase in supplies such as masks, gowns, gloves, rapid 19 test kits, testing agents, and materials for vaccines. Secondly, that states and schools will see more funding. Thirdly, that a federal testing board will be created to increase testing, boost U.S. manufacturing of tests, support screening for schools. Fourth, travelers would be required to wear masks in airports and on most trains, ships, intercity buses, and airplanes. International travelers will have to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test before departing to the U.S. Next, a preclinical drug discovery and development program will focus on developing treatments for pandemic threats. And finally, and I'm skipping over some, liaisons will be established for each state as the administration supports the launch of, as already noted, 100 federally backed community vaccination centers. Finally, on January 21st, that's the same date the executive orders were issued, President Biden released a 198-page plan entitled, quote, National Strategy for the COVID-19 Response and Pandemic Preparedness, end quote, to complement and put into context and focus on end goals is executive orders organized around 7 goals. Slide 16. First, increasing trust. Doing this by sharing data publicly around key response indicators. Prioritizing outreach to local governments and vulnerable, underserved communities. Secondly, mounting a safe, effective, comprehensive vaccination and public education campaign. Third, mitigating the spread of COVID through expanded masking, testing, treatment, data, workforce, and clear public health standards. Fourth, and I mentioned this earlier, invoking the Defense Production Act, which originally was passed during the Korean War, to take certain steps to expand vaccine manufacturing, such as producing more equipment and materials used to make shots. He will also use the act to boost supplies such as low dead space syringes, which can be used to squeeze more doses out of vaccine vials. In addition, vaccine makers, which have pledged dose targets by invoking this law, can increase the pace of vaccinations partly by helping to make more available the pledged supplies faster. Fifthly, safely reopening schools, businesses, restaurants, and travel, while protecting workers by updating OSHA guidance. 6, protecting those most at risk and advancing equities, including along racial and ethnic lines, in establishing the COVID-19 Equity Task Force. And finally, we're almost there, 7th, build better preparedness for future pandemic threats, and in that regard, establishing the National Center for Epidemic Forecasting and Outbreak Analysis to prevent, detect, and respond to biological threats. And that was on the 21st. Almost every day since then, there has been some new directive or supplement. It's tough to keep track of, but it's an administration that I think we'd all agree hopefully that has really hit the ground running. I'll close my presentation and a rather lengthy one and pass the floor to my colleagues with who else but Dr. Fauci. And Dr. Fauci, in commenting about the new approach by the Biden administration, said, and I quote, "The idea that you can get up here and talk about what you know, what the evidence is, what the science is, and know that's it. Let the science speak. It is something of a liberating feeling," end quote. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Alan. Next, we'll hear from Paul Josephson regarding the state implications and opportunities.
Paul, I think you might be muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep, can, yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So what I was saying, thank you, Sheila, for the baton. Thank you, Alan, for carrying quite a considerable load there. Just so much packed in, and I think you did a great job. My job here is to talk about our state implications and opportunities in the new administration in considering COVID response. And fortunately for all of you, I'm not going to give you the sort of an in-depth discussion that Alan just gave you, because to do that for the 50 states, we'd be here all day. But I can tell you that the Duane Morris website is a great resource for state-specific COVID information. We keep that up to date with as the law, rules, regulations, executive orders change, court rulings change, and I would recommend to you strongly spending some time with the Duane Morris COVID-19 page for state-specific information, if that's what you're looking for, and certainly to reach out to any of us on this webinar. Or to the attorneys on that page for state-specific information. What I'm doing today here is really to provide more of an overview and to talk about, from my perspective, as somebody who's spent 30 years working for and with state government, what the implications are, what the opportunities are in this new administration. As Alan just indicated, there are a lot of new federal faces for state actors to know. And when I say state actors here, I'm talking about folks, both government officials as well as businesses that do a lot of business with the states or that are regulated by the states, or perhaps our schools and those who do business with schools. Bottom line is, as Alan just pointed out, we've got a lot of new faces, a lot of folks, a lot of them we know. As Alan indicated, he goes back with several of them. The new testing coordinator comes out of the state of New Jersey and is somebody that we know very well here in our office, in my office. Where do I see us heading in this new administration? What are the implications for the states? Well, first, I think as Alan's presentation made very, very clear, there's going to clearly be stronger policy coordination with and coming from the federal government. When you see a plan like the 198-page plan that Alan wrapped up with, that has a 20-page executive summary, folks are in the weeds there. What are we going to see? I think we're going to see a lot more uniformity in masking and distancing mandates out of the federal government, applicable at the state and local level. I think we're certainly going to see more uniformity in testing and vaccination policies and implementation. Certainly, there will still be room for states to implement policies as appropriate for their locales. But nevertheless, I think in terms of having a strong guiding hand from the federal government, that is certainly something that you've got to expect for the next 4 years. And that may happen on a voluntary basis, but I suspect, and having been through these sort of issues before, with all that federal money that is going to be flowing out to the states, out to local entities, I think we can all expect and should expect that conformity, if not complete compliance with federal mandates, will be a condition of federal funding. So real important to keep an eye on how the Biden administration is proceeding here. Certainly for the states and those who work with states, I certainly think we're going to see improved vaccination distribution. That's not a political commentary. That's just a matter of time and getting better at this as we do it. It's obviously been a bumpy launch, but I do think we'll get better at this over time. And certainly, I think every indication from the federal government has been that this administration is not afraid to really push hard to speed up the distribution. We're seeing that already. I hope very much. We have gone through a very, very difficult 2020, and it would be foolish to think that 21 is going to be a rose garden or easy, but hopefully we are on a road to recovery here. And I do believe, and I hope, and I suspect that many of you listening to this hope, that our efforts as a country to recover will be a dominant force. It will be a unifying force to heal the partisanship, to heal the rancor, frankly, that we have gone through for the last year. That's a little bit more aspirational, perhaps, than a prediction. But I think with the president's leadership, I think the president is very mindful of the opportunity that this crisis presents to bring the country back together. And I certainly think he will try to make this a unifying force. And frankly, there could be no greater accomplishment for our country going forward. Leadership implications at the state level. What we have seen in the last year, very clearly, governors and mayors are the battlefield marshals in this war on COVID. The new players on the field, on the battlefield, are the vaccination czars. I'm calling them the vax czars. And what I'm noticing here in New Jersey, in New York, and in other states where we are active, is that now that there is a vaccination out there to be released and distributed, some very, very competent individuals are being put in positions to oversee the distribution plans in particular states. And my prediction is that individuals who come in here and prove to be adept at coordinating vaccination efforts in their states, in their cities, are really going to kind of rise to the top as folks who are folks who can make government work. And as a result, it's really my sense that our response as a country is going to forge the next generation of folks who are going to be leading our government at not only the state and local levels, but ultimately the federal level. Hopefully, as well, it's going to attract a new generation of younger adults coming out of school to really think about public service as a important part of what their career may be. Other leadership implications that we're seeing right now, boy, I don't need to spend much time on this at all. We all know what's happening with restaurants and small businesses in our communities. But from a state perspective, these lost businesses, they mean lost income tax revenues, the decline of retail that we have seen over the last couple of years, at least retail in person, bricks and mortar, it seems to very much be advancing more quickly as a result of the pandemic. Certainly what we are already seeing are many, many property tax appeals being filed on property taxes across the various states that we are in. There's not a commercial landlord out there who is not looking at the strategy of cutting their property tax obligations in view of their losses that they're incurring. And as a result of that, we can expect that state and local governments are going to be receiving less taxes. Another pressure point on states, remote work implications as people are working not in their traditional offices. We are seeing battles breaking out between Massachusetts and New Hampshire, New Jersey and New York about what do we do when that person who normally commutes into New York is no longer and when the New Jersey resident commutes to New York and pays New York income tax, what happens when that employee is no longer commuting into New York and is sitting at home working? Very, very big issue that the states are struggling with right now. We already have, I believe the Massachusetts-New Hampshire dispute is already pending before the United States Supreme Court. There will also be significant implications on the tax incentive programs that many states have out there to attract and retain businesses. COVID, the last year, has just kind of thrown all the suppositions about tax incentive programs right out the window. So we do expect to see big changes in those programs. Key issues to think about, I think we've, as Alan referenced, the federal government intends to invoke the Defense Procurement Authority for both vaccines and supplies. We are already seeing governors like Governor Cuomo in New York questioning whether or not the states should still be able to direct purchase vaccines from the vaccine makers. I don't have any good predictions for you here about who's going to win that one, but I never count Governor Cuomo out. He's a very, very smart guy with a bunch of smart advisors around him. Whether or not the feds will effectively allow states to go out and direct procure is unclear at the moment, but something certainly to be watching very closely. Next major issue that I see out here and is the question of vaccine passports, which is kind of a somewhat new notion, but really at the end of the day, it's not. When the pandemic hit originally, one of my first observations was, boy, this cell phone is going to become your lifeline. It's going to become your point of entry to every public forum. That was about a year ago. That was kind of my initial reaction as I looked at what was going on and what was likely to happen. Insofar as your phone was really going to be the easiest way to do tracking who you were in contact with. And likewise, it becomes a very secure way to demonstrate that you have been vaccinated now that we have a vaccine. This will become a big issue, I think, both for the state and local governments, thinking about as they reopen their government buildings, as they reopen schools, as they reopen various public services, is the state going to make you come in and, basically provide tracking information on yourself as well as vaccination information as a condition to come into a government building or to take advantage of a government service? Obviously raises a ton of privacy issues and concerns for individuals. And all I can say on that one is, Apple and the government pretty much already know where you are when you're carrying this thing around. It does not seem like a big leap for state government and employers to require us to really rely on our cell phones to track us and to make sure that folks are vaccinated. The one thing that's for sure, when you put all of this together, massively increased state and local expenses, shrinking tax revenues, as Alan highlighted. We've got hopefully a lot of federal funding coming through to help fill those gaps. One of the biggest implications when we talk about state budgets is always the cost of education, the cost of labor generally, but especially education. This pandemic has revealed in a way that I don't think any of us expected, the essential role of educators and economic resilience. We always knew the teachers were important for our kids, but now what we've all learned is that, boy, if there aren't teachers in schools and places for our kids to go from 8 a.m. in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it makes it really hard for this economy to work. Boy, have we learned that. There are huge implications here, but also huge opportunities for state leaders. I'm going to leave it to Lisa later on to speak to the education issue, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But there are huge new costs for the states on the education front ahead. There is a question of educational remediation. We need to catch up on lost and diminished instruction time of at least a year, possibly longer. A lot of discussions about having longer school days, extended academic years, Saturday summer classes. These are all great ideas to catch our children back up to what they have lost from not having in-person education, but that's going to be costly. This was a really, interesting estimate statistic that we picked up along the way. One estimate of the cost of catching up on 7 to 8 months of lost learning, $12,000 per student over a 5-year period. Collectively, over $300 billion to reach half of the K-12 population in the country. That's a lot of money to come. And unknown is what the special education impacts are going to be and what the long-term costs are of the year of in-person instruction that we have provided, in-person services that we provide through special education programs. Anybody on this call who has worked with children who have special education needs or developmental disabilities, a year lost during the early childhood years, even during adolescence, very, very, very costly to catch back up on. Just to give you a sense of the dollars and cents that we've invested already, $13 billion. I've heard estimates of $13 to $16 billion were injected for the education sector in spring of 2020, another $50 billion at the end of the year in December 2020. To give you a sense of context, right now and for the last 10 years, the federal government has generally spent about $35 to $40 billion annually towards K-12 education, on top of the $600 billion that are spent by states and towns collectively every year. President Biden is proposing over $130 billion injection of funding. Big question will be if that's enough. One of the crazy things about this crisis has been, the sorts of numbers that we are talking about now in our stimulus packages and our recovery packages. They are just breathtaking. But I think that'll continue to be a big open question. But I'm going to end on a positive note because, it's been attributed to Rahm Emanuel. It's been attributed to Winston Churchill. I'm not sure who said it first, but there is always the aspect of never let a good crisis go to waste. Now, this has not been a good crisis, but Lord knows it has been a big crisis, and it has exposed a lot of issues, a lot of weaknesses in our society, and a couple of those trends that I think create huge opportunities at the state level, both for states and for businesses that deal with them. We have all learned that as much as we don't want to rely on digital and we like to meet with each other in person, if you are not connected to the internet with high-speed broadband access, you are going to be left in the dust. That's happening from an educational standpoint. It's happening from an employment standpoint. And I do think in this administration, we can expect to see significant additional investments to expand wireless broadband across the country, both in urban areas as well as in our rural areas as well. So that's a big opportunity. I think that's out there. Likewise, this pandemic has revealed the frailty of our healthcare delivery and our medical supply infrastructure. Those who were saying, boy, we should not be outsourcing our production of medical supplies to China, and who were basically, kind of like yelling into the wind, a couple of years ago. People are listening to them now. We have regulated bed count in hospitals strictly in order to try to drive down healthcare costs. But now this pandemic comes along and we find out we don't have enough beds. We don't have enough ventilators. So we found that out. And I think there will be a significant investment both in healthcare delivery and in onshoring our medical supply system. generally larger infrastructure spending as well across the board. And that spending, I think, will flow through, in many cases, state government and into state economies. One interesting thing is, will this pandemic bring us a little bit closer to healthcare for all? I am not sure about that, but we'll leave that for another session. We've got other folks to talk. But I would like to kind of leave you with the thought that the long-term implications here of the federal government's exercise of EPA authority, I think, to onshore the production of medical supplies, to reduce the costs of medical supplies and drugs, there is a lot of opportunity out there for businesses and state governments that are looking for opportunities to revitalize their economies by bringing that production, expanding production that exists in states. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton off or back to Sheila. Sheila, thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul. Next, we'll take a deeper dive regarding the impact of COVID-19 on two legal topics. First one will be education, addressed by Lisa Scruggs, and the second is Rosa Ertz will address international contracts and trade.
Thanks a lot, Sheila. I thought it would be interesting to start out our deep dive into the education industry by talking about which issues were driving business and the overall landscape in education. And one interesting way to do that would be to examine some of the headlines from key industry publications that were out there in early 2020, and then compare them to those headlines that we are seeing now. I pulled a sample of headlines from Education Week and from the Chronicle of Higher Education from early 2020. And what those headlines suggest is that you really had each segment of the education industry at that time in early 2020 just navigating the traditional but weighty questions about how best to serve students and customers in the education market. In the early childhood education field and pre-K, you saw them focusing on how do you expand access, a lot of discussion around increased investment in Head Start, as well as private pay, community-based, and public preschool providers. You also then had a lot of focus, the areas of dispute were around, how much access do private service providers get to additional dollars, philanthropic dollars to public dollars. At K-12, in elementary and secondary schools, we spent a lot of time focused on school shootings. Everybody recalls there were a number of school shootings, a lot of advocacy and energy driven in large part by students to address these issues. We also, at the federal level in particular, but also in the states, saw a lot of discussion of deregulation and privatization, and how much of that is going to be productive. How do we more effectively and efficiently deliver instructional services? Also discussion, of course, about the use of technology, but really focusing on the value of technology in the classroom and the quality of the kinds of innovations that you saw with e-learning. Focus on cybersecurity, how to protect students, dealing with bullying, cyberbullying, as well as in person, and then also some issues around quality school lunch. At the post-secondary level, a lot of focus on Title IX and how to implement new regulations, the changes between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. The Me Too movement, gainful employment rules, a lot of discussion around that. Again, a change from one administration to another. Deregulation was also a big topic around student loan programs and also on accreditation requirements. So here's a sample of these are actual headlines from Education Week and from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And again, they reflect the focus on those issues that I just highlighted. Now take us to January 2021, and we see how quickly things can change. By January 2021, we see that the issues that consume the education industry in early 2020 were replaced by COVID-19 related questions and disputes. Those headlines that we looked at have been replaced by those associated with the COVID-19 crisis, and to a lesser extent, the continued fallout from this summer's events and the racial reckoning that followed. So here again, we see, we look at these headlines. These are headlines from the exact same publications, but in January 2021, from Education Week and Chronicles of Higher Education. And they, I think, really illustrate just how much an impact the pandemic has had in just 1 year. When we look at these headlines more closely, we see a pretty stark contrast from those headlines that we had in January of 2020. For example, when we look at the issue of school shootings and Me Too that were focused on in early 2020, what we see in January 2021 is a real focus instead on learning loss. I think Paul referenced it in his discussion about the amount of resources that we can expect to be devoted to trying to figure out how to help students and help them recover from all of the academic losses, the learning losses that have occurred due to, in part, the transition from in-person learning so quickly to remote learning. But also we've had significant concerns about certain populations who simply have either been lost in the system, have been attending school in disproportionate numbers, and in particular for our more vulnerable populations or diverse learners. So students who are receiving special education services and those students who are English language learners. The transition to try to figure out how to provide quality services in either hybrid situations or in person is something that I think a lot of schools and the organizations that serve schools are still trying to figure out. So the attention to learning loss and trying to figure out how to fix that is going to be significant. In addition to the learning loss focus, instead of Me Too, instead of school shootings, you see a real focus on social and emotional learning. School districts and the organizations that they serve are really struggling to figure out how to respond to stakeholder concerns around racial injustice and inequity. A lot of the issues that were raised over the summer in light of the various police killings and all of the reaction to them have really brought to the fore these types of concerns. So you now see a lot of focus on not just changes and trying to address the stakeholder concerns through dialogue, but also you've seen renaming of schools, replacing executives, and wholesale changes in curriculum. Also, you see, taking a look at some of the headlines around deregulation. You had in 2020 states criticizing the Trump administration about deregulation and about waivers. Those same states, a lot of them are now pushing for flexibility on accountability measures. So looking to try to figure out how are we going to hold schools accountable in face of the significant changes brought on by the pandemic. We see instead of provoking arguments around the content of student lunches, right, the quality of the student lunches, there's now just focus on getting people fed, getting students fed, and dealing with the food insecurity problem that's a direct result of the pandemic and the job losses and economic insecurity that's resulted. At the college and university level, you've seen a shift in focus from the spread of cyber attacks, frankly, to the spread of the virus on campus and trying to focus on how to stem enrollment losses. Again, the coverage in these two publications, which are pretty broadly circulated within the education industry, really demonstrate what a shift has been and what I think we can expect going forward in 2021. So just to quickly take a look at each segment, when we look at the early childhood segment and we look at K through 12 and colleges and universities, we can confirm what the headlines suggest. Whether in pre-K or in college, our work now and for the foreseeable future is going to be focused and impacted by COVID-19. As you can see, for early childhood, the primary challenge during the pandemic has been basically how do you remain open, notwithstanding the declining enrollment numbers and the enrollment that has been driven by either shelter-in-place orders that keep parents at home and lessen their need for childcare, or their ability, frankly, to get childcare outside the home. Or executive orders and emergency laws that were put in place that actually limited the number of children that could be served in person. So changes that would require changes in your facilities, changes in teacher or care providers to student ratios. All of those things increase costs and really force a lot of childcare providers to either close or to indicate very loudly to their policymakers that without additional resources, they were going to be forced to close, either during the pandemic, but certainly now in 2021. The funds that they're asking for are to cover rent, utilities, all of the facilities improvements that would be needed, as well as PPE costs, ventilation supply needs, and everything that they had to do to accommodate class sizes. One of the things that we saw this summer, and as the government funding continues to be allocated, as we continue to expect, right? We've seen two major bills so far. We expect more funding to be directed to schools and early childhood learning centers and programs. One big question is the extent to which those funds are allocated between and amongst the various providers. So private pay providers, community-based centers, Head Start programs, who is going to qualify for those funds and how are they going to be allocated? Those are questions that will continue to persist. In K-12, we have a number of issues in particular that show very clearly the impact of the pandemic on our schools. Just to touch on a few, because there's so much we could talk about here. You saw unprecedented investment in education technology and applications. One example is you had new organizations, new companies come to the fold. Class EDU was able to raise very quickly $16 million in private equity and venture capital funds in order to figure out how to use Zoom more effectively in the classroom, to tailor the program to Zoom. In San Antonio, they approved a $90 million bond to pay exclusively for education technology that was used to facilitate remote learning. And that was something that was done very quickly and in the summer. You see these significant enrollment shifts from public to private school and to homeschooling enrollments, right? We all now are familiar with learning pods and people who were dissatisfied with the types of learning that was being provided from their public schools or from their private schools, frankly, and were looking to figure out how to provide some level of in-person learning, getting together, opting for homeschooling, and creating either mini or micro schools or learning pods. One interesting example of other types of accommodations on this front is in North Carolina. One school district in particular saw a wholesale change in the number of students enrolling in virtual schools. The district decided to open 2 fully virtual schools that would be open to their public school students. And they saw a shift where basically by the end of by the current school year, you had 10% of that district enrolled in virtual schools rather than in their traditional schools. Something that Paul talked about, and I think Alan referenced as well, is you're going to see, certainly we've seen the significant changes to the economy that have impacted other industries, but there's no doubt, there's an expectation that as these economic conditions continue, that impacts state budgets, which in turn impacts school budgets, and that also, of course, in turn impacts those organizations in the industry that serve schools. One thing in particular we saw was prior to the pandemic, you saw a lot of expansion of public and private school choice across the country in various states. A lot of that has been brought to a halt by this, even though you've seen innovation and changes and growth in other areas around academic enrichment, around e-learning, and different software applications designed to serve students who are now learning from home and teachers who are teaching remotely. Just to quickly move on to some of these other impacts around sustained remote learning and lack of in-person learning, we saw a lot of concern and a lot of research, and now what I anticipate to be a lot of resources directed at dealing with learning loss, with the mental health and social emotional effects of the change and quick shift to remote learning. A lot of concern around expansion of the achievement gap. And then I'm sure a lot of parents, myself included, can relate to this one. A lot of concern about what it meant to have students sitting in front of a screen for the majority of their day, what that meant not only for their eyesight, but also for their physical health, them not being outside, not engaged in recess. And then just to touch on the racial reckoning as well, a lot of concerns here, highlighted, I think, this summer, as we discussed. You saw further attention to the disparities in health. You saw disparities in terms of the economic conditions, the impact of changes in the economy on different racial groups and ethnicities and those who are more socioeconomically vulnerable. That's true in education as well. Concerns around the digital divide, particularly in remote areas and rural communities where there's little access to broadband, that all became clearer as part of the pandemic. Attendance and class participation differences, that's something that we've seen, and it continues to be a concern among school leaders and the organizations, again, that serve them. And then also one of the interesting things that you're seeing now as we see schools really trying to reopen and provide some level of in-person learning, a disparate acceptance of remote learning and opposition to reopening plans. You see a racial gap and a disparity in terms of people's desire to come back to in-person schooling. At the post-secondary level, you, of course, saw colleges and universities of all types being forced to shift very abruptly from in-person to remote learning, and in some cases back to remote learning after they shifted back to in-person. A lot of shifting back and forth caused over the summer and continuing a number of disputes around whether to make tuition refunds or to reduce tuition. You also saw serious enrollment drops at college and university levels, students either deferring or putting off their arrival at school. And on a high note, though a positive note, you did see many universities becoming centers of innovation and research during the pandemic. So a lot of the work that we're seeing around the vaccines, some of that is coming from the fact that you have universities that were hosting and doing a lot of that research. And finally, the racial reckoning brought a lot of attention to the college experience of diverse students and women on campuses, a lot of calls for change from alumni, from faculty and current students, some litigation as a result of that, but certainly also calls for changes in policy, changes in curriculum, similar to those that you saw at the K-12 level as well. From that, I'll now turn it over to Rosa to talk more about international contracts and trade.
Thank you, Lisa. As a parent, I certainly have suffered on a personal note the challenges that education have suffered. So doing a complete switch, I know that we have a limited amount of time, and there's a wide variety of topics that I could touch with respect of the impact that COVID has had in international trade and international contracts, and the impact that's still having. So I'm just going to give you a very general overview of the impact worldwide, and specifically on supply chains and on international companies. So in today's globalized economy, supply chains are more interconnected than ever before. And COVID has been a clear proof of such interconnection. COVID has impacted not only the ability to get supply from suppliers from different countries around the world, but also on the prices that end consumers have to pay. Some factors like sanitary protocols, challenges in logistics and transportation, employees training, they all mean additional costs that result in cost increase of final products. From a legal standpoint, this has resulted in breaches of international contracts, increased number of renegotiations, and additional litigation. Parties have to renegotiate terms of contracts to adapt to the new circumstances imposed by the pandemic. Many industries have been affected. Most of the most important ones, or the ones majorly affected, have been tourism, manufacturing, oil and gas, construction, and retail. And the companies have been forced to change their business models and to find ways to build their liquidity. Companies around the world are reevaluating the geography of their supply chain. Different costs of energy, labor, transportation, among others, have changed. So part is just a recalculation of the specific components that go into the operations of a company. The challenge now is how to make their supply chains more resilient without weakening their competitiveness. So specifically in the North American region, where we are right now, the COVID-19 pandemic has put into focus the importance of the interconnection of our supply chain. In particular, the supply chain in the aerospace and automotive industries, which is far more complex and connected than in many other industries and in many other regions. They have a significant amount of suppliers for various kinds of commodities. Accordingly, the collaboration between the US, Mexico, and Canada is crucial for future development of these industries, as there is a need to harmonize the approach between them. Sorry, having some technicalities here. One of the biggest challenges faced by these industries were the mandated closures in the 3 countries and the different classifications of essential business made by each country. For example, the manufacturing of one single product that involves a manufacturing process in both the US and in Mexico, where raw materials and unfinished product cross the border multiple times to get a final product. The US and Mexico unfortunately failed to communicate with each other to take into consideration supply chains when they classified activities or business as essential and when the lockdown of certain activities took place last year. This resulted in having part of the manufacturing process allowed in one country as an essential activity, but not allowed in the other, therefore breaking the supply chain and the ability of companies to deliver finished product to end consumers. The world is also facing a regionalization trend, by which countries in different regions around the world are working together for a better and stronger development in several industries. And this is evident more in some certain parts of Asia and Europe. And North America countries need to follow suit. They need to work together in order to be strong competitors to the other regions across the globe. We need to maintain our partnership and further develop the relationship and resources so that we can minimize the potential breakup in the supply chain that was caused by the pandemic. In order to do so, the trust between these countries must be strong. The enforcement of the USMCA, which took effect in July 2020, it will be a crucial tool for these countries to maintain the relationship and strengthen the connection of supply chains. Respect to international travel, mobility, and restrictions on certain contracts, I know that some of my colleagues touched on some of the new restrictions on temporary travel and mobility. And while they're driven by public health considerations, these measures have significant trade implications as well, as human mobility across the border is a key facilitator of trade in goods and services, and an important type of services trade in its own right. Such measures and restrictions have an impact on compliance and enforcement of international contracts as well. It is also becoming evident that restarting the international mobility of individuals is going to prove to be much harder than it was to stop it. The resumption of international travel is unlikely to proceed in a linear fashion. Measures affecting transnational mobility have obvious cross-border spillovers, which means there is a case to be made for supplementing domestic action with international cooperative efforts, which this new administration is focusing on. While many of the changes in trade costs can be expected to revert once the pandemic is brought under control, some may persist because of shifts in the policy environment or market dynamics. For instance, government policy choices will play an important role in shaping and mitigating uncertainty-related trade costs. To the extent that the government responses to the pandemic go on to increase or reduce trade policy uncertainty, they can be expected to increase or reduce trade costs in the future as well. So just to give you some statistics on, international trade, on the impact of the pandemic worldwide, the World Trade Organization forecast a 9.2% decline in the volume of world merchandise trade for 2020, followed by a 7.2% rise in 2021. The projected decline is less than 12.9% drop foreseen in the optimistic scenario from the April trade forecast. Trade volume growth should rebound to 7.2% in 2021, but will remain well below the pre-crisis trend. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development expects GDP to fall by around 4.3% in 2020, with an expected global recovery of 4.1% in 2021. Developed economies are expected to be more affected in 2020 than developing countries, at minus 5.8% and minus 2.1% respectively, and expect a weaker recovery in 2021 at plus 3.1% compared with plus 5.7%, which was pre-pandemic. According to the UNCTAD, unlike the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, developing countries are expected to experience negative growth in 2020, and developed economies are expected to experience a much steeper fall in output. In the Americas, both developed and developing countries are expected to experience a negative output growth in 2020. Argentina at minus 10.4%, Brazil minus 5.7%, Mexico at minus 10%, and the US at minus 5.4%. Downside risks still predominate, particularly if there is a resurgence of the COVID cases in the coming months. So the outlook is a little bit gloomy, but hopefully, by 2022, it will be much better. With respect to foreign direct investment, the pandemic has also a negative impact. The foreign direct investment flows have fallen dramatically. And although the outlook remains dire, with further deterioration even this year, the exceptional global circumstance as a result of the pandemic have led to delayed implementation of ongoing investment projects and the shelving of new projects, as well as drying up foreign earnings, of which normally a significant share is reinvested in host countries. As a result, global foreign direct investment flows are forecast to decrease by up to 40% in 2020, from their 2019 value of close to 1.6 trillion. FDI, foreign direct investment, is projected to decrease further in 2021 and only to begin to recover in 2022 at the earliest. This has resulted in a halt in specific private equity investments, mergers and acquisitions that have been suspended or canceled, at least on the international aspects, and specifically in some countries which have been hit the hardest from the pandemic. Regulators in the US and in Europe have reported delays in approval process for also mergers and permits that are required to construction projects as well. The impact of the pandemic on different industrial sectors has been uneven. The production of essential goods and supplies such as food or pharmaceutical products was less affected than that of other industries. Although in the second quarter of 2020, the production of basic pharmaceuticals registered moderate growth across all country groups. All other industrial sectors have experienced significant declines in output, most notably motor vehicles, machinery, equipment, and apparel. But by the second quarter of 2020, China, where declines in output were first registered, was already starting to enjoy positive growth across several industry factors. So there's still some hope that we will get there too. Sheila, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, we are running over, but the next topics, we just would like to finish up this deep dive. And so the next topic for the deep dive is what has occurred so far in the Biden administration. And we'll try to finish up in about 15 minutes for those of us watching.
Thanks, Sheila. So we'll try to run through this pretty quickly. Before we turn to the actual priorities and policies that were ushered in by the new administration, I thought it'd be instructive just to take a quick look back at what priorities the then candidate Biden had proposed as part of his education platform. Again, a focus here, tripling federal funding for disadvantaged students, full funding for the law that provides services to students with disabilities, creating universal pre-K programs, and raising teacher pay. So again, things have shifted pretty dramatically as a result of COVID-19. And just taking a look at the different segments in the education industry. So first, looking at education, early childhood education. As Paul mentioned, the Biden administration took several steps within the first days of the inauguration to establish its education priorities. For each segment, the administration announced plans for increased investment of funding to cover reopening costs, a collection of data to inform future decision-making, issuance of federal guidance to help states and local governments to ensure that the schools reopen and stay open. And that is reflected here in the early childhood education program priorities and the policies that either have been put in place because of the executive order or the legislation that's being proposed. When you take a quick look here, the goal overall and the overriding priority is to prevent child care center closures. So whether you're talking about community child care, whether you're talking about actual preschools or private pay child care and learning centers, the idea here is to ensure these organizations, these companies, these schools can remain open, operate safely so that families feel secure that they can send their children back to these child care and early childhood centers and they can go back to work. So in the first days, the executive orders that were mentioned, those that were focused on education, the one that was focused on education, focus on the health and human services and require them to do a few things: provide guidance to child care providers and Head Start programs on reopening and operating, and in particular with an eye towards social emotional needs of families, children, and staff due to COVID-19, to provide some technical assistance on the accelerated distribution of federal funds. I think I mentioned previously one of the issues is around how do you make sure that you're getting funding to all of the child care providers, given the diversity of the segment, given the diversity of the early childhood education landscape. You've got private pay providers, you've got schools, you've got Head Start programs, community-based programs, home-based programs. How do we ensure that we have funding formulas that are going to get the resources to where they need to be in order to ensure that, again, this kind of widespread financial disruption due to increased costs and less revenue doesn't shut down childcare providers. Similarly, they're going to collect data. You're going to see this across the different segments, collect data that's needed to inform the safe reopening of these programs, and then also coordinate with other federal actors to equitably allocate COVID-related supplies. So ensuring, namely here, tests, screening devices, and vaccines, of course. And then also they want to support the development and operation of contact tracing programs. As far as legislation in particular, the Biden administration is proposing $25 billion in emergency stabilization funds specifically targeted to child care providers, and then another $15 billion, interestingly, directly to help families afford child care. So it'll be interesting to watch to the legislation to see what form that takes and how that plays out. When we look at the priorities for K-12, I think three key themes emerge. First, the administration has concluded that schools can and will safely open within the next 3 months. He's made this promise to reopen K-8 schools within the first 100 days to in-person learning. It's also another theme here. It's important to approach the work of reopening with an equity lens and being mindful to allocate resources in ways that close rather than widen inequity and opportunity and achievement gaps in schools. So you'll see a lot of attention to disaggregating data, to ensuring that formulas are looked at in ways that direct resources to where they are most needed. And again, just being mindful, looking at everything through that equity lens. The third theme here, I think, is focusing on evidence-based decision-making. So a lot of focus on research, on data collection. And when you look at the executive order that was issued, you see just that. They're saying we're going to issue evidence-based guidance on safe reopening and direct it from the federal government into the states and local governments, as well as to all of the different service providers that work in the education industry. They're going to provide advice on the various modes of learning. So try to bring to bear the best thinking about hybrid, in-person, and remote learning. One of the biggest challenges that you've heard from educators in hybrid situations is trying to figure out how to deliver instruction to both students who are in person as well as those who are at home continuing to learn without increasing substantially the staff that's in the classroom. And so the Biden administration is promising to provide better guidance on how that can be done. There's a specific proposal to develop safer schools and campuses best practices, a clearinghouse, which would be owned at the federal government level and utilized. Hopefully, their hope is it would be utilized more broadly among service providers. To prepare a report on disparate impacts of COVID-19 on K-12 students specifically, and to collect data on the impact of COVID-19 on students and educators more broadly. They also expect to see a report identifying strategies specifically to address the impact of COVID-19 on educational outcomes, presumably so that can help in decision-making and investment allocation of investments and resources on dealing with the learning loss that they expect to find. For HHS, there were also the executive order directed HHS to provide guidance on meeting social emotional needs of children, families, and staff due to COVID-19, to provide technical assistance on accelerated distribution of federal funds, and then also, again, to collect data needed to reopen K-12 schools, to coordinate with other federal actors, and to support the development and operation of contact tracing programs. In addition to that, the executive order encourages the FCC to increase connectivity options for students without reliable home broadband. Presumably, this is a nod to the disparities that we see, in particular in rural areas and in those states where you don't have reliable, consistent broadband access throughout that state. For post-secondary institutions, the policy here and the focus is on reopening and keeping colleges and universities open for in-person learning. We've seen in this second semester, by and large, many colleges and universities reopening their campuses and bringing students back, but they will need additional funding in order to ensure that they have the sufficient resources for PPE, for contact tracing. I think I've said that wrong a few times now. Contact tracing, testing, screening, and of course, to the extent they become available, getting everybody vaccinated. So they've proposed a $35 billion infusion of emergency stabilization funds to be directed to colleges and universities. And again, that executive order touches on those same themes, but directs them to colleges and universities around evidence-based guidance, as well as technical assistance, and then reporting on disparate impacts to college students.
Thank you, Lisa. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to be very fast here. So the most important international policies on health issued by the Biden administration are first to restore the Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense at the National Security Council. It was originally established by the Obama-Biden administration that was disbanded by Trump. And the Directorate is responsible for monitoring global health risks, including disease outbreaks, and coordinating the federal government's response. President Biden is also further reinstating ties with the WHO. Dr. Anthony Fauci has been appointed head of the U.S. delegation to the organization's executive board. And in the meeting that they had on January 21st, Dr. Fauci informed the executive board meeting that the U.S. is committed to working constructively with partners to strengthen and, importantly, reform the WHO, to help lead the collective effort to strengthen the international COVID-19 response worldwide and address the secondary impact of the same on people, communities, and health systems around the world. The Biden administration also intends to fully be engaged in advancing the global health, supporting global health security and the global health security agenda, to work multilaterally to respond to and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes that the intent of the U.S. to join COVAX and support the ACT accelerator to advance multilateral efforts for COVID-19 vaccine, therapeutic and diagnostic distribution, which also includes research and development regarding to the virus. The U.S. is committed to transparency. They will be building global health security capacity, expanding pandemic preparedness, and supporting efforts to strengthen health systems around the world and advance the sustainable development goals. So moving on, the new policy on immigration taken by the Biden administration have also been very important. I think one of the most relevant ones has been the bolstering of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, also known as the famous DACA, that protects from deportation immigrants brought to the United States as children. This order further calls on Congress to enact legislation providing permanent status and a path to citizenship for those immigrants. The DACA was originally done also in the Obama-Biden administration. Another order overturns a Trump's executive order that pushed aggressive efforts to find and deport unauthorized immigrants. And another order blocks the deportation of Liberians who have been living in the United States. President Biden also has put a halt on the construction of the border wall in Mexico. And hold on, give me 1 second. And it also has stopped the immediate termination of the national emergency declaration that allowed the Trump administration to redirect billions of dollars into the wall. Importantly, the order states that the administration will begin a close review of the legality of the effort to divert federal money to fund the wall. There are also important new policies on the environment. I think the most important one is that President Biden has signed actually a letter to re-enter the U.S. in the Paris Climate Accords, which will officially rejoin in late February. As you know, in 2019, Trump formally notified the UN that the U.S. will withdraw from the coalition of nearly 200 countries that are working to move away from planet-warming fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. With respect to international travel, I know some of my colleagues, like Alan, already mentioned the requirement of wearing masks on interstate planes, trains, buses, for international travelers to quarantine after arriving to the United States. One thing that is not 100% clear is how this administration is planning to enforce the quarantine requirements. And on January 26th, a federal policy took effect whereby all international passengers headed to the U.S. will first need to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test. The new policy requires all passengers, regardless of vaccination status, to get a test for current infection within the 3 days before their flight to the U.S. departs. Airlines are the ones now responsible to confirm the negative results for all passengers or the documentation of recovery before they board, and must deny boarding to a passenger if said passenger does not provide proof of a negative test or recovery or chooses not to take the test. With respect to anticipated policies, there's a number of anticipated policies and they're listed here, and I know that we'll be sharing in the slides with all of you. So I'm just going to touch on a number of them. I know we're running out of time. Rebuild and expand defenses to predict the pandemic and prevent them. We launch the U.S. Agency for International Development pathogen tracking program called PREDICT. Direct the USAID in coordination with the U.S. Department of State, the DoD, HHS, and the CDC to mobilize an international response that assists vulnerable nations in detecting, treating, and minimizing the spread of COVID-19, including deploying, when necessary, USAID disaster assistance response teams. It also calls the creation of the Global Health Emergency Board to harmonize crisis response to vulnerable communities. President Biden has also communicated the importance of his administration to protect America's troops and deploy citizens by bolstering CDC and DoD's disease detection and protection programs overseas as well, and providing testing, care, and treatment to the U.S. troops in all parts of the world. And all this is part of the effort to re-embrace international engagement and to take the leadership in a lot of international matters that the U.S. historically has been taken for many years, and that it was put a stop or a halt in the prior administration. And now more than ever, with the pandemic, the challenges faced worldwide by the pandemic, the U.S. needs to step up and provide leadership like they have done in the past. So I think with that, and here you have the list of all the anticipated policies that I will not mention, but you can see them here, and we will share them with you. Sheila, I'll give you the baton to continue, I think, the last part of our presentation.
And then Lisa and Rosa, if you could just provide a summary of the last part of the presentation, which is really the recommendations and best practices in light of the new administration.
Absolutely. So I will turn directly to some of the more practical, advice and points that we want to make about schools and the education industry. Here you see what we expect in terms of schools and education industry response. But in terms of what different schools and organizations that serve schools need to do, the first point is just to really prepare and plan, but be ready to pivot. That's something that I've been saying quite a bit. So what does that mean in practice? You can look here, but it's really trying to negotiate contracts with contingencies in mind, thinking about force majeure, thinking about waivers, other types of protections, developing multiple options, multi-track plans, calendars. We're going to see a lot of focus on accessing government funding to support reopening efforts. It's not going to be a matter of if schools are going to get additional funding and organizations that serve them are going to get additional funding. It's going to be when, it's going to be how that money is allocated. So it's going to be really critical to stay up to date, to get sound advice about what are the different strings that are going to be attached, because undoubtedly, I think as Paul referenced in his presentation, there are going to be strings attached. So in order to ensure that you don't end up 2 years from now dealing with adverse audit findings or investigations, it's important to get sound advice around complying with those requirements. Also, to the extent you are in a private actor working closely with public schools, being mindful that it may require some legislative and advocacy efforts to ensure access to funding. And then finally, monitor the changing accountability procedures that are likely going to be put in place. You're going to, on some instances, want to be proactive. In others, you may just have to, comply. But you have to be mindful about what those changing accountability measures are going to be. There's going to be a huge emphasis on managing your workforce. Make a plan for vaccination. Invest in a communication strategy. We're already seeing the union and labor influence on the ability of large-scale school districts to reopen. That's not going to end anytime soon. So it's going to be important to think about your litigation budgets because there's just going to be a lot of litigation around these issues. And then around enrollment, you're going to need to rethink your recruitment strategy and your management of your enrollment management systems. There's going to be a lot of investment, a lot of tools out there, but I think we have a very different landscape than we did prior to COVID. So it's going to require a lot of attention. So I'll end there, and again, we'll be happy to circulate this and answer questions after everything, after the session ends.
Thank you, Lisa. I mean, for multinational companies, they have to be prepared to develop new strategies of how they can provide better services to customers without increasing their costs. They need to understand the risk undertaken and the vulnerabilities of their supply chain, logistics, and operations. And the pandemic has really brought out, where the vulnerabilities, the breaking of the supply chains, and the weaknesses of all businesses. So companies have to be open to renegotiate contracts, to enter into new ones, and unfortunately, as Lisa said, also to budget for specific, legal advice, financial advice from experts of how to best manage the pandemic, how to shift and move from the different challenges faced by each government, by each county, by the new mandated regulations that are being enacted as the pandemic starts spreading. As a result, it is likely that they have to be resilient. They have to be resilient by understanding their full network of suppliers, and they can take steps to address it so they can actually be efficient as well. They have to build visibility and have an opportunity to rethink the network structure and the geography of their supply chain, which is also very important. It is vital to ascertain how long a company could ride out of a supply shock without shutting down or out of their employees being 100% full-time working, and how quickly an incapacitated area or node could recover or be replaced by something else when the entire industries are being faced by disruptions like the ones faced now with the pandemic. The obvious way to address heavy dependence on one medium or high-risk source, like a single factory, supplier, or region, is to add more sources in locations that are not vulnerable to the same risk. So expand and take advantage of our globalized economy and look into other regions. And perhaps after the pandemic begins to recede, also WTO members may also wish to look back at the responses they have on the pandemic and what effect on the trade of each country the responses have. And that could be a very important learning lesson for each country. Shall I turn it over to you to conclude our presentation?
Alan, Paul, Lisa, and Rosa, thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you everyone who stayed on for the additional information. We didn't want to rush through the presentation because there's so much information. So the name of the series is Navigating Forward, because as we all navigate forward from COVID-19 into the next steps of law and business, we're going to have to figure out the ways to do it in a time and cost-efficient way. Thank you very much. Have a good day.